Have you ever stopped to think that one of the biggest biological mysteries of all time wasn't cracked in some high-tech lab, but in a quiet monastery garden? Well, today we're diving into that story. We're cracking the code of life itself, and it all comes down to a brilliant monk and his incredibly patient work with a simple pea plant. Okay, let's just jump right in with a question every single one of us has probably wondered about. You might have your mom's eyes, maybe your dad's nose, but you're not a carbon copy of either of them, right? You're a unique mix. So where do those similarities come from? And what about all the little differences? This puzzle, this question, is really at the heart of what makes you, well, you. So to really get to the bottom of this, we need to get two key ideas straight. First, there's inheritance. That's just the process of passing traits down from parents to their kids. And second, you've got variation, which is the reason why even brothers and sisters aren't perfect clones of each other. For centuries, people knew this happened, but the big mystery was how. How did it actually work? And this is where our protagonist enters the scene, Gregor Mendel. But don't just think of him as a monk or a botanist. You got to think of him as a detective. And his crime scene, it was a simple garden plot. He was absolutely determined to uncover the hidden rules that governed this whole process. I mean, for literally thousands of years, people knew that traits were inherited. It's how they bred better crops, how they domesticated animals. But the actual science behind it? Total black box. The common idea was that traits from parents just kind of blended together, like mixing two colors of paint. But Mendel, she had a hunch there was something way more precise going on. So this is what made Mendel so different. Why did he succeed when so many others had failed? Well, his approach was totally revolutionary. First, he was patient. He spent 7 years meticulously running his experiments. He picked the absolute perfect test subject, the garden pea, because it had all these simple, easy-to-see traits. But his true secret weapon? He counted everything. He used huge sample sizes, and for the first time ever, somebody applied statistics and math to a biology problem. It was a game changer. And just look at this. This gives you an idea of the sheer scale of his work. He wasn't just looking at one thing. No, he tracked 7 totally different characteristics, and each one had 2 clear opposite forms. Was the stem tall or dwarf? Was the seed round or wrinkled? Flower violet or white? This systematic approach let him spot patterns that literally no one else had ever seen before. Okay, so this is where our detective story really starts to get good. Mendel's very first experiment threw him a huge curveball, a major clue. He was suddenly faced with a case of a disappearing trait, a trait that seemed to just vanish into thin air. So his setup was actually pretty simple but brilliant. He started with what he called true breeding plants. All that means is he took a tall plant that only ever produced other tall plants, and he crossed it with a dwarf plant that only ever produced other dwarf plants. Then he planted the seeds. So what would you expect? Maybe some medium-sized plants? A mix of both? Well, the result was stunning. Every single one of the new plants was tall. 100% of them. The dwarf trait didn't blend in. It didn't show up at all. It was just gone. It had completely, totally vanished. And this was the central mystery. If traits just blended together, this should have been impossible. The instructions for being dwarf had to be in there somewhere. But where? And, like any good detective story, this solution came with a fantastic plot twist. See, Mendel didn't just stop there. He took his investigation to the next generation, and what he found would end up changing biology forever. So Mendel took those tall plants from that first generation and he crossed them with each other. Now remember, every single one of these plants came from one tall parent and one dwarf parent, even though they all looked tall. The stage was set for the big reveal. And this was it. This was the key. 3 to 1. That ghost trait, the vanished dwarf trait, it reappeared. And it didn't just pop up randomly, it appeared in a precise, predictable mathematical ratio. For every 3 tall plants that grew, there was 1 dwarf plant. A perfect 3 to 1 ratio. This number was the clue that cracked the whole case. So here's the massive insight Mendel had. Traits weren't blending at all. Instead, he realized that something was being passed down in these little, discrete packets, these stable units from parent to child. He called them factors. And these factors could be hidden for a generation, but they were never lost or blended away. Today, we don't call them factors, of course. We call them genes. And the different versions of a single gene, like the version for tallness and the version for dwarfness, we call those alleles. And we use a capital letter, like a big T, for the trait that shows up, the dominant one, and a lowercase t for the one that gets hidden, the recessive one. And this leads to a super important distinction. The genotype, that's the actual genetic code an organism has, like TT, TT, or TT. The phenotype is what it actually looks like on the outside, tall or dwarf. So just as Mendel discovered, you can have two plants with totally different genotypes, like a TT and a TT, but they have the exact same tall phenotype. And this simple little grid, the Punnett square, is the elegant tool that makes it all make sense. It lets us map out all the possible combinations of alleles from the parents. So when you cross those F1 plants, the ones with the TT genotype, the square shows us there's one chance to get TT, two chances for TT, and one chance for TT. And since both the TT and TT plants look tall, you get 3 tall plants for every 1 dwarf plant. And there it is, the 3-to-1 ratio, perfectly explained. And case closed. The dwarf trait was never lost. It was just being masked or dominated by the tall trait in that first generation. It was just waiting patiently in the genetic code to show up again when the conditions were right. So Mendel's work was obviously about way more than just peas. The discoveries he made in that quiet little garden laid the groundwork for our entire understanding of the human genome, and honestly, so much more. It's really hard to overstate how important this was. The laws of inheritance he came up with are, without a doubt, the bedrock of modern genetics. Pretty much every discovery that came after stands on the shoulders of his initial brilliant insights. In fact, you can draw a perfectly straight line from his experiments in 1863 through its rediscovery decades later by other scientists, all the way to 1953. That's when Watson and Crick finally figured out the physical structure of those factors Mendel had theorized about, the DNA double helix. He had described the rules of the game almost 100 years before anyone even saw the playing pieces. It's just incredible. So why does a 19th century discovery still matter so much today? Because it's literally everywhere. It's the basis for how we understand and treat genetic diseases, how we develop new medicines, how we breed crops that can feed a growing world. The entire field of molecular biology basically grew from the seeds of his work in that garden. So when you boil it all down, Mendel wasn't just a biologist. He was an innovator. He solved an ancient puzzle by applying a completely new method, math and logic, to the natural world. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other huge mysteries are out there right now, just waiting for someone to come along and look at them from a totally different angle?